Well, Rania, I
Well,
want to just move forward because our other guest has been waiting
yeah.
very patiently here, so I don't want to keep him waiting any longer. He's a very important person, you know. That's Manolo De Los Santos, co-executive director of the People's Forum and researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, joining us to talk a little bit more about the global scene. Manolo, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be back with you, Eugene and Rania.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you here. You know, many, many months ago, I remember we had you to talk about Ukraine. And one of the things we were talking about in that context was how much, you know, the vast majority of the world was deeply at odds with the Western nations. And it seems, you know, looking at the UN vote around the issue of a humanitarian truce or ceasefire, from what we've seen with the protests happening around the world, statements of the government, that this is yet another issue that reflects the erosion of U.S. Western hegemony on the global scene. Do you think that's a fair statement?
It's a completely precise statement. I would say, and add further, that what we are seeing right now is a global rebellion of the peoples of the South, who are pretty much, for the first time in 3 decades, trying to actually live out their sovereignty. They have independent policies that favor their own people. And I think in relationship to what's happened in Palestine, it's also a simple reaction to just the total distortion of the truth and reality that the US and their ally Israel have put on the global stage. Who can look at what's happening in Palestine and think otherwise?
Yeah, Manolo, one way that I kind of see the reaction from the West and the global North to October 7th is this kind of visceral fear that they have of people in the global South hitting back at the garden, right? You have like the jungle people militarily shooting at the garden. I mean, look, I'm just using Joseph
No, I
Borrell's
know, I
language. I'm
know. It's
sorry. Does
just,
that
it's so
sound
absurd.
racist?
It's hard not to
Does the
react.
language of the EU's foreign minister sound racist? Bizarre. But I'm just using his language.
Yes.
But no, in all seriousness, I mean, you had, and I think Eugene's made this point really well before, is historically speaking, the reaction to slave revolts has always been this like really vicious, violent response to make sure it doesn't happen again. And the reaction to Native Americans hitting back. And I think what we see here is, we're in sort of a crisis moment for capitalism, imperialism emanating from the global North, where what happened on October 7th scared not just the Israelis, it scared the Americans and it scared the Europeans, because we're moving towards a very different world where they might not always be the ones in charge. And I'm just curious if you could speak to that. I don't know what your thoughts are. Maybe you completely disagree. Um, but, what do you think about the reaction that we're seeing, where you have this just full throttled, disgusting support for genociding Gaza in response to October 7th?
Well, I think we're living in a world where the reactions are becoming much more clear cut. I mean, on one hand, you clearly see how the ruling countries of the world, the countries that consider themselves to be the policemen of the world, the US, the European Union, Canada, Japan, look at what's happening in Palestine, say, this is an attempt of the brutes, or as you say, the people who are coming from the margins, the people who are coming from the jungles, to try to take over what is theirs. But the narrative, the vision, the story that many people, I would say billions of people who inhabit the global South, and I would say not just people, but their leaders, their political leaders, are interpreting what's happening now as a confirmation of what we've been told to stay quiet about for the last 3 decades. We were told with the triumph of neoliberalism that colonialism was a thing of the past, that state violence on behalf of colonialism was a thing of the past, that we would no longer see massacres and violent actions like Israel and the US commit. But what we've seen, we've been forced to see, actually an affirmation that colonialism is still alive, that the US imperial project is very much alive and intends, in this genocidal war in which it's sponsoring Israel's actions, it intends to wipe off the Palestinian people off the map. Who else has had to face this reality? You can look across the map of the global South and you will see hundreds of countries that have been faced with that same reality, with that same dilemma. So I think we've come to a point where it's no longer feasible for many countries in the global south, regardless of the ideological leanings of each of these governments, but it's become clear that they can no longer be silent. Because if we were to allow, under the current circumstances, for the people of Palestine to be wiped out in a shameful genocide, we know many other countries are next on the list. Because the project that the US is imposing with its bodyguard, with its Praetorian Guard called Israel in the region, it's not simply to wipe out the Palestinians, to impose its political and economic agenda on the rest of the region, and I would say the rest of the planet. Like we were talking in the past about Ukraine, and we did now with Palestine, it's clear that new lines are being created, new fault lines are being created in the world politics today. And at this point, if you don't have the courage to stand up for Palestine, it's almost like you are putting yourself at the back end of history, unable to see what's happening, and that there's a moving train of global outrage for Palestine that is moving quite fastly before our eyes. We either get on it or we will be crushed by it. And I think that will be the fate of Israel. It will be crushed by the global outrage that the world is experiencing.
Well, I'm glad that you pointed out the fact that it is really global and we're seeing a lot. And when we talk about the issue of quote unquote multipolarity, the question is, what are the different poles that are emerging? We've seen a pretty clear one, through the ALBA countries in the Americas presenting a very strong social vision. I mean, what have we seen from countries like Cuba, especially Venezuela and others, in terms of how they have responded to what's happening with this genocide in Gaza?
I mean, we have in general been seeing this tendency of many more countries officially speaking out. I mean, we have countries like Colombia and Bolivia that have, spoken out and have recalled their ambassadors, Belize, Chad, and many other countries around the world. But we have to recall the, I would say, courageous position even before October 7th. The fact that countries like Cuba broke relations with Israel in 1973 and since then have been the only country in Latin America who refuses, on all terms, in the most harshest of terms, to have any relations with Israel is remarkable. The fact that countries like Venezuela broke relations with Israel in 2006 at a time when it wasn't a popular thing to do. And both of these countries not only have, in a sense, been the clarion of consciousness for the rest of the region, and I would say for the rest of the world, they have sought to actually mobilize their people. I mean, last week there was, I think, the only march in the world led by a head of state, the Cuban president Miguel Diaz-Canel, in support of the of the Cuban and Palestinian solidarity movement. And he spoke at this rally clearly saying, not only do we support the call for a ceasefire, but we support the legitimate struggle of the Palestinian people to have a free and sovereign state. And I think this is just a demonstration of both the historic links between the peoples of Palestine and Latin America, and particularly Cuba. Also, that countries like Cuba, who in many ways are under heavy attack from the US, are not hesitating, are not afraid, are actually willing to take the courageous stand of being in solidarity with Palestine, whatever it may cost. It may cost many more years under the US blockade for Cuba, but that is not something that the Cubans, and they've articulated this very well, are willing to even consider when it comes to standing up or not for Palestine.
Do you think there's ever a chance that we go back? It just kind of feels like we're in a new era after this in terms of the way the vast majority of the world perceives the United States and its European partners moving forward. It just seems like this has really shattered whatever existed before October 7th. Especially, I mean, one thing when we talk about Cuba, for example, or any country in Latin America that dares to stand up to, the US trying to dictate how they can behave or run their countries, is this rhetoric of human rights and of democracy. I mean, we all know that a lot of those words are very meaningless when it comes from US officials. But you mentioned the last 30 years. For the last 30 years, this is the rhetoric that's been used. These are the tools that have been used to really try to beat countries in the global south into submission, coups and destabilization campaigns in the name of human rights and democracy and abiding by like liberalism and humanitarian values. It doesn't seem like any of that will be possible after what the US has supported in Gaza.
Well, at this point, I don't know what would be the normal that humanity would
Yeah.
return to in relationship to the Palestinian struggle. I think that the global movement in solidarity of Palestine is only growing. It's becoming stronger. It's becoming an element of just basic elementary human consciousness at this point for billions of people around the planet. And that, in fact, it is generating sharp contradictions even within the US's own camp. I mean, everyone always refers to Latin America as the US's backyard, but I actually think the real backyard of the United States is Europe. In that backyard, in countries like Spain, for example, we're seeing major diplomatic standoffs between Israel and the Spanish government, for example, because the Spanish government, despite not being a left wing or a progressive government, is actively calling for a ceasefire and has been rebuffed and attacked by the government of Israel for doing so. It has come to the point where, after weeks of attacks, now the Spanish government is even calling to recognize the state of Palestine. I think these are contradictions that will continue to sharpen over the next period. And then I imagine that in 2024, this movement is only going to grow because of the fact that Israel has not only demonstrated clearly, and this is being referred to by different states across the planet, it's being referred to for its war crimes. It's been clear to everyone its genocidal intent. But what has become even clearer to a larger number of people is that ultimately Zionism, the apartheid state, 75 years of occupation are not compatible with the most basic human values that we share as a global community. And in fact, the public and diplomatic space that Israel could have bought with all its US funds, with the billions of dollars it gets from the US, have been squandered because no one at this point believes, and as the majority of people in the world believe, that Israel has a right to exist as a racist and Zionist state predicated on violence against other people. No one believes that it has a right to defend itself when it is, in fact, an occupying power that uses brute violence and denigrates the humanity of the Palestinian people.
Manolo De Los Santos, co-executive director of the People's Forum, researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We are very thankful to you, as always, for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you for your courageous journalism.